The case I'm about to walk you through took 8 months to close. 8 months of meticulous work by a team of investigators who never stopped pulling at threads. But the thread that unraveled everything, the moment that changed the entire direction of this investigation, lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds of surveillance footage, captured by a camera above the entrance of a hospital emergency room. 4 seconds that a detective watched 112 times before putting her notes on paper. I want to be careful about how I frame what you're about to hear. Body language is not evidence. Body language does not convict anyone. What body language does is give trained investigators a signal, a reason to look harder. That distinction matters. It matters legally. It matters ethically. It mattered enormously in this case. My name is Marcus Cole. I spent 8 years with the NYPD before moving to Chicago, where I worked homicides and unsolved cases for 2 decades. I've been in rooms with liars. I've been in rooms with people who were innocent and terrified. I've been in rooms with people who were both at the same time. The difference isn't always obvious. Sometimes it only shows up in 4 seconds of tape. If this kind of investigation interests you, real cases, real science, the actual work behind closed doors, subscribe right now. Hit that bell. Every week I go deeper into how these cases are actually worked. Not the version you see on the news, the version that happens in the hallways and interview rooms. Now, let's go back to March 14th, 2019, a suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio, a neighborhood where the houses all look the same and people mostly keep to themselves. At 6:47 in the morning, a man named Daniel Mercer called 911. His wife Amanda was unresponsive in the master bathroom. He said he'd woken up, realized she wasn't in bed, found her on the tile floor. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. Amanda Mercer, 38 years old, was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial assessment was a cardiac event. She had no documented history of heart disease, but she was a healthy adult. Sudden cardiac death in adults under 50 is rare, but it happens. That's what the first responders put in their initial report. Probable cardiac event, natural causes. But the detective on call that morning was a woman named Sandra Harmon, 14 years on the job, the last 6 working domestic fatalities. She arrived while the paramedics were still on scene, and she did what good detectives do. She watched. Daniel Mercer was standing in the driveway when she pulled up. He was in a bathrobe. His hands were in his pockets. He was watching the front door of his home with an expression that Harmon later described, in her own words, as carefully arranged. That phrase, carefully arranged, that's what started everything. Harmon introduced herself, expressed condolences. Watched Mercer receive that information. He nodded. He said something like, "I can't believe this is happening." He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the ground. None of that is abnormal. All of that, taken in isolation, is consistent with shock. Shock is a powerful neurological state. It suppresses emotion, slows cognition, produces repetitive movements, and disconnected speech. Someone who has just experienced a traumatic loss may look exactly like Daniel Mercer looked that morning. Harmon knew that, but Harmon also requested a copy of the hospital entry footage. Standard procedure when there's an ambulance transport, even in a presumed natural death. She wanted to see what Mercer had looked like when he arrived at the ER, to be told his wife didn't make it. The camera above the ER entrance captured him getting out of a neighbor's car. The neighbor, a man named Gary Foss, who lived 3 doors down, had driven Mercer to the hospital. Mercer walks toward the automatic doors. He stops. He looks at his phone. Then he walks inside. Those 4 seconds, between the moment he stopped and the moment he walked in, are what Harmon watched 112 times. I want to explain exactly what she saw, because understanding this requires understanding what behavioral scientists call the grief response sequence. When a person receives news of a sudden, unexpected death and is then transported to a hospital, they are in anticipatory distress. Their nervous system is already primed for the worst. Their physiological state is one of acute stress. When they approach that ER entrance, their body reflects that state in measurable ways. Elevated cortisol produces specific physical patterns. People in genuine acute grief tend to move in compressed, self-protective ways. Shoulders rotate inward. Gait shortens. The face displays what behavioral scientists call muscle effort, the physical work of suppressing overwhelming emotion. Brow depressor muscles activate. The corrugator supercilii, the muscle that draws the eyebrows together, fires without conscious control. These are involuntary. You do not decide to make that face. Your nervous system makes it for you. What Harmon saw in those 4 seconds was Daniel Mercer standing outside the ER doors, looking at his phone, with his face in a state of complete relaxation. Not shock, not suppression, relaxation. His jaw was loose. His brow was smooth. The corrugator was not firing. For that 4-second window, he was a man standing outside waiting for a table at a restaurant. Then he looked up, walked through the doors, and the performance resumed. That was the tell. Let me be precise about what I mean by performance. I am not making a moral judgment. I am describing what behavioral science calls effective masking, the deliberate regulation of visible emotional expression. All human beings do this to varying degrees. We are social creatures. We manage how we present ourselves. But effective masking requires cognitive effort, and cognitive effort produces what researchers call leakage. Leakage is the term used by Paul Ekman, the psychologist whose work on microexpressions became foundational to modern behavioral analysis. Ekman's research, initially skeptical in the scientific community, later replicated across cultures, demonstrated that genuine emotional states produce brief, involuntary facial expressions lasting between 1/25th and 1/5 of a second. When a person is actively suppressing an emotion, those expressions leak through the mask in fragments. But that's not what Harmon saw in the 4 seconds. She didn't see leakage of real grief through a suppressed mask. She saw something more unsettling. She saw a complete absence of the physiological markers of distress in a moment when the person believed no social performance was required. He was alone, essentially, on a sidewalk. He had dropped the performance because he didn't think he needed it. And then he picked it back up. That is a different category of observation. And it shifted Harmon's classification of the case from natural death to undetermined. She didn't announce that. She didn't accuse anyone. She opened a quiet inquiry. The Reed technique, developed in the 1950s by John Reed and Fred Imbaugh, has been the dominant framework for investigative interviewing in American law enforcement for decades. It's also controversial, and I'll get to that. But within the Reed model, the initial interview phase, what Reed called the behavior analysis interview, involves asking a subject questions designed not to extract confession, but to establish behavioral baselines. You ask easy questions first. You observe. You note how someone sits when they're comfortable. You note their eye movement when they're retrieving a genuine memory versus when they're constructing an answer. You build a map of what this specific person looks like when they're not under stress. Then you watch what changes when you move into sensitive territory. What most people don't know is that gaze direction is far less reliable than pop psychology suggests. The old rule that people look up and left when remembering and up and right when constructing has not held up to rigorous scientific scrutiny. What is reliable is gaze interruption. When a question produces discomfort, many people will shift their gaze to a neutral anchor point, a spot on the wall, the table surface, their own hands. This is self-soothing behavior. It reduces cognitive load during high-stress processing. Harmon brought Mercer in for what she called a follow-up conversation. Nothing formal. She framed it as routine. She needed to fill in a timeline for the medical examiner's report. Mercer agreed. He came in voluntarily. He was cooperative, polished, and appropriately sad. She asked him to walk her through the night before Amanda's death. He did, calmly and in detail. They'd had dinner at home, watched television. He went to bed around 11. Amanda stayed up a bit longer. She did that, he said. She was a night owl. He woke up around 6:30. She wasn't there. He found her. Harmon watched his hands during that description. When he talked about finding his wife, he pressed his palms flat against his thighs. That's a grounding behavior. It's also consistent with genuine distress recollection. She filed it. Then she asked an unexpected question. She asked what he'd had for dinner. He paused. Not a long pause. 2 seconds. But he looked to his left. Not up. Directly left. And then answered. Pasta. Something Amanda made. Harmon moved on. A few questions later, she circled back. What kind of pasta? He paused again. Said he didn't remember exactly. Could have been something with chicken. The hesitation on detail-specific memory retrieval around the meal was noted. Not because it proved anything, because it was a thread. The peace model, developed in the United Kingdom in the 1990s as a direct response to concerns about coercive read technique interrogations producing false confessions, takes a different approach. PEACE stands for preparation and planning, engage and explain, account, closure, and evaluate. It is an investigative, non-accusatory framework. The goal is not to break someone down. The goal is to gather a complete, detailed account and then find the inconsistencies within it. Harmon had been trained in elements of both frameworks. She was building an account. While the conversation happened, the rest of the investigative team was quietly pulling threads elsewhere. Financial records, phone records, Amanda Mercer's medical history, insurance policies, property records. Amanda Mercer had a life insurance policy worth $1.4 million. Daniel Mercer was the sole beneficiary. That alone means nothing. Most married couples have life insurance. The beneficiary is typically the spouse, but the policy had been taken out 11 months earlier. Amanda had no prior life insurance. Daniel had proposed the policy. He'd mentioned to a friend that they needed to get their affairs in order. The friend didn't think much of it at the time. Later, it was a thread. The toxicology results came back 6 weeks after Amanda's death. The medical examiner had ordered a full panel because Harmon had flagged the case as undetermined. And buried in the toxicology report was something that shouldn't have been there: succinylcholine. This drug is used in medical settings as a muscle relaxant. It's administered intravenously in operating rooms. It paralyzes skeletal muscle, including the diaphragm. A person given succinylcholine without respiratory support will suffocate within minutes, fully conscious, completely unable to move. It metabolizes rapidly after death, which is why it has historically been difficult to detect in autopsy toxicology. It breaks down into its component molecules, succinic acid and choline, both of which occur naturally in the body. But the medical examiner who ran the Mercer autopsy used a technique called liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry. It's more sensitive than traditional toxicology screening. It found trace quantities of succinylcholine and, critically, unusual concentrations of succinic acid in the urine. The profile was consistent with third-party administration of the drug. The cause of death was reclassified. Amanda Mercer had not died of a cardiac event. She had been murdered. Now Harmon's 4 seconds of footage took on an entirely different weight. Daniel Mercer worked in pharmaceutical logistics. He had for 12 years. His job involved coordinating drug distribution for a regional hospital network. He had access to controlled substances. He had documented knowledge of succinylcholine. 3 months before Amanda's death, a small quantity of succinylcholine had gone missing from a hospital in the network he managed. The discrepancy had been noted internally, but attributed to administrative error. Harmon and her team executed a search warrant on the Mercer home. In a locked case in the garage, behind a set of socket wrenches, they found 2 syringes. Both had been wiped. Both still registered trace amounts of succinylcholine. The case was now a murder investigation with a named suspect, but Harmon didn't make the arrest immediately. She needed Mercer in the room. She needed to see what he did when the performance had no more room to run. She called him, told him there were new developments in Amanda's case. Could he come in? He said of course. He arrived the next morning in pressed clothes. He looked grieved and cooperative and ready to help in any way he could. Harmon walked him through the toxicology findings. She watched his face as she described what succinylcholine does to a body. His jaw tightened, not from emotion, from calculation. He was processing the new information and deciding what to do with it. That jaw tightening, the masseter muscle engaging under pressure, is what behavioral scientists call a contempt microexpression variant, not contempt in the emotional sense. The physical act of bearing down, of clenching against an incoming threat. It lasts fractions of a second. Harmon saw it. She asked him directly if he knew what succinylcholine was. He said yes. He worked in pharma logistics. Of course he knew what it was. His voice was steady. His hands were flat on the table. She told him trace amounts had been found in his wife's body. She watched his eyes. His eyes went still. Not shock still. Not the kind of stillness that follows an unexpected blow of information. Still in the way water goes still when you stop pouring. The motion was already done. He already knew. He had been waiting for this sentence. His lawyer arrived 40 minutes later. Over the next 6 months, prosecutors built the case layer by layer. The insurance policy timeline, the stolen succinylcholine, the syringes, phone records showing Mercer had searched using an incognito browser for the terms succinylcholine detection autopsy and how long does succinylcholine stay in system. Searches made 8 weeks before Amanda's death. A witness from Mercer's workplace who testified that he had spoken about Amanda's life insurance policy in casual conversation, unprompted, months before her death. Body language evidence was never introduced in court. It couldn't be, and it shouldn't be. No jury should convict a human being because a detective watched 4 seconds of tape and felt something was wrong. What that 4 seconds did was give Harmon a reason to push the medical examiner to run a deeper toxicology screen, a reason to pull the hospital pharmaceutical records, a reason to treat this as something other than a natural death, when every easy assumption said to close the file and move on. That's the work. That's what good investigators do with behavioral signals. Not convict, investigate. There's a debate in forensic behavioral science that I want to address directly, because I think it matters and because it's often glossed over in crime media. The Reed technique, which I mentioned earlier, has produced documented false confessions. Research by the Innocence Project and academic criminologists has demonstrated that high-pressure interrogation methods, which the later stages of Reed involve, can cause innocent people to confess to things they didn't do. This is not a fringe finding. It is a consensus finding in the academic literature. The behavioral observation components, the baseline setting, the nonverbal analysis are less problematic. The coercive interrogation components are where Reed breaks down. Peace was developed specifically to address this. British law enforcement largely moved to peace after documented wrongful convictions tied to coercive interviewing in the 1980s and 90s. Modern American law enforcement is increasingly adopting elements of what's called the cognitive interview technique, a model developed by psychologists Ronald Fisher and Edward Geiselman that focuses on mental reinstatement of context, open narrative recall, and witness-friendly questioning. It is not designed to detect deception. It's designed to maximize the accuracy and completeness of information provided by cooperative subjects. All of this is to say, behavioral analysis is a tool that exists within a larger system, a system that has known failure modes, a system that has wrongly incarcerated people. Good investigators know this. They use behavioral signals to guide inquiry, not to substitute for it. The 4 seconds of tape guided Harmon to a murder investigation she might otherwise have never opened. But it was the toxicology, the syringes, the pharmaceutical theft, the digital search records, and the insurance policy that built the case. The 4 seconds were the door. The investigation was what was behind it. Daniel Mercer was convicted of first-degree murder in November of 2020. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence through sentencing. His attorney argued the toxicology findings were inconclusive. The jury didn't agree. After 4 hours of deliberation, they came back unanimous. Amanda Mercer was 38 years old. She had worked as an elementary school teacher. Her students raised money for a memorial garden outside the school in the spring after she died. Her family still speaks publicly about the case and about the importance of thorough death investigation, about not assuming natural causes and moving on. What I keep coming back to when I think about this case is Harmon in that parking lot, watching a man on a surveillance screen stand outside hospital doors in complete stillness. All around him, crisis. Inside him, apparently, nothing. The human nervous system is not built to manufacture genuine grief. You can cry. You can say the right words. You can wear the right expression when people are looking. But the baseline, the unmanaged state, the 4 seconds when no one is watching, that tells a different story. Grief has a physical signature. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It produces fatigue, muscle weakness, slowed heart rate during the deepest moments of sadness. Acutely, it produces cortisol surges. People in real grief look exhausted and overwhelmed. They are not managing their faces when no one is looking because they have nothing to manage. The grief is just there. What trained investigators learn to look for is not grief itself. It's the effort of performing grief in the absence of it. That effort leaves seams. It leaves moments of rest between acts. Harmon found one of those moments in 4 seconds of tape. She didn't arrest Daniel Mercer because of it. She opened a file. That's the job. If this is the kind of case analysis you want more of, real science, real investigation, no shortcuts, subscribe. This channel is built for people who want to understand how this work actually happens, not just how it looks on a documentary. I've been in these rooms. I know what's actually being watched and why. New cases every week. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.